Then the Buddha goes on, similarly questioning, can an action to be experienced in the here and now be turned through striving and exertion into an action to be experienced in the future life? No, friend. Can an action to be experienced in the future life become one to be experienced in the here and now? And different kinds of variations on that. And then the Buddha concluded, that being the case, the striving of the Nigantas is fruitless and their exertion is fruitless. Such is the teaching of the Nigantas, and such being the teaching of the Nigantas, 10 legitimate deductions can be drawn in good grounds for censuring them. Number 1, if beings experience pleasure and pain based on what was done in the past, obviously the Nigantas have done bad things in the past, which is why they now feel such bad pain. If beings experience pleasure and pain based on the created act of a supreme God, okay? So, everything's created by God. If you're suffering, then obviously you've been created by a bad God, okay? Now, this is not directly a criticism of Jains, because the Jains didn't believe in God, but it is, I think, this is a variation of what we know in the West as the argument from evil, right? That if God is the one who created the world, he's created evil, created pain, therefore he must be a bad God. If beings experience pleasure and pain based on luck, obviously they've got bad luck. They've obviously had a bad birth. If pleasure and pain is based on efforts in the here and now, obviously they've made bad efforts in the here and now. If it's what it's done in the past, if beings experience pleasure and pain based on what's done in the past, they deserve censure. If not, they still deserve censure. And so on and so forth. Such is the teachings of the Jains monks, and this is how striving is fruitless, how exertion is fruitless. So then it goes on to show the Buddhist path. How is striving fruitful and exertion fruitful? There is the case where a monk, when not loaded down, does not load himself down with pain, nor does he reject the pleasure that accords with the Dhamma, though he is not fixated on that pleasure. He discerns that when I exert oh my goodness, no, that's not English. When I perform this act against this cause of suffering, so against this defilement, then from performing this act, there is dispassion. When I look on with equanimity at that cause of suffering, then from the development of equanimity, there is dispassion. So he performs an act against the cause of suffering, and so on. And thus the suffering coming from the cause of suffering is ended, and the suffering resulted from the cause of suffering for which there is dispassion through the development of equanimity is ended. All this is very poorly translated and sounds much more complicated than it really is. But all it's really saying is that in some cases, when there's something arises and you need to do something to counteract it. Okay, and then that can eventually lead to dispassion. But then in other cases, there's nothing that needs to be done, and you just look on with equanimity, and that will also lead to dispassion. So in either case, you can respond. So this is referring to, if you're, for example, if you're meditating, or if some tendency in your mind arises, right? And sometimes you have something arise in your mind. Sometimes you need to do something about it, right? Maybe you have a strong hatred arise in your mind, strong anger, and you have to reflect on that. So you have to counteract it. You have to, think about that person, reflect on them, develop compassion towards them to help you let go of that anger. But in other cases, you don't need to do that. In other cases, feeling of anger just arises. You're just aware of it. You have equanimity, and the feeling goes away. Okay. So that's all of this is saying, that either way, you can come to that state of peace. So, suppose that man is in love with a woman. His mind is ensnared with fierce desire and fierce passion. He sees her standing with another man, chatting, joking and laughing. What do you think, monks? As he sees her standing with another man, chatting, joking and laughing, with sorrow, lamentation, pain, dis-suffering. Oh, wow. And despair. Some kind of typo there. Anyway. Arise in him. Yes, Lord. Why is that? Because he's in love with her. Yes, suppose that thought would occur to him. I'm in love with this woman. My mind is ensnared with fierce desire and passion. So I get this sorrow when I see her talking with another man. Why don't I abandon my desire and passion for that woman? So he abandons his desire and passion for that woman. Afterwards he sees her standing, talking and chatting with another man, and then he doesn't feel despair anymore. So the same way, when the monk not loaded down does not load himself down with pain, nor does he reject pleasure that accords with the Dhamma, though he's not infatuated with that pleasure. Furthermore, the monk notices this: when I live according to my pleasure, unskillful mental qualities increase in me and skillful mental qualities decline. When I exert myself with suffering and pain, though, unskillful qualities decline in me and skillful qualities increase. Why don't I exert myself with suffering and pain? So he exerts himself with suffering and pain, and while he's exerting himself with suffering and pain, unskillful qualities decline in him and skillful qualities increase. And then at a later time, he would no longer exert himself with suffering and pain. Why is that? Because he has attained the goal for which he was exerting himself with suffering and pain, and that's why at a later time he would no longer exert himself with suffering and pain. So again, when it says that exerting yourself with suffering and pain, obviously it doesn't mean the kinds of extreme self-torment that we're just talking about, but it probably just means, pushing yourself in meditation, maybe staying up a bit later than you wanted to, or sitting a bit longer, and so on and so forth. So trying to do things which are maybe unpleasant or uncomfortable for a while, but again, you're not doing it because it's intrinsically good to experience that pain, but you're doing it because when you see, only when you see, that it actually creates more good, skillful qualities. So this is something that happens, and especially in earlier in practice, when you have habits of maybe sleeping in too late or something like that, and you have to make yourself get up early in the morning, and you get up early in the morning when you're on retreat, and you're like, oh, this is really bad, and you're sitting there like, oh, and so sometimes you just do that, and you endure that for a few mornings until you get used to it, and after a while your mind gets more clear and more awake, and then you get up early in the morning and you're quite happy to sit there and meditate. Yeah? But maybe if you do that for a few times, and you find that your mind still is really dark and dull and depressed and so on when you meditate, and you realise actually it's not creating good karma, right? It's not actually clearing my mind because I'm just too tired to meditate. It's not a good time for me. So if it's not actually accomplishing anything, you don't force yourself to do it just for the sake of it, right? So you observe what is the effect of this thing in your mind. And this is a teaching that we got as young monks. We travelled to the monastery of Ajahn Mahabur in Thailand. Ajahn Mahabur is very famous for his sort of ascetic practices and so on. The monks there like to do things like, fasting or not lying down and so on. And the vice abbot, Lumpur Panyawada, a very old English monk, he made a point of, when he's talking to the young monks, of saying that these kind of practices are completely useless unless you can see that they're actually overcoming these unwholesome tendencies. And one of the things that we find is that, especially with young people coming to practice, is that often they feel the need to kind of push things, right? So you're always trying to get further, you're always trying to achieve more, you're trying to go faster. And so you push by doing these kind of ascetic practices and things like that. But you're not actually achieving anything. You look in your mind and you see, is this actually overcoming unwholesome dhammas? So in some cases it might do, right? And that's fine. But then after a while, then when it's achieved its purpose, then you don't worry about it anymore. Suppose a fletcher were to heat and warm an arrow shaft between two flames, making it straight and pliable. Then at a later time, he would no longer heat and warm the shaft between the two flames. Why is that? Because he's attained the goal for which he was heating and warming the shaft. And in the same way, it repeats the practice. Furthermore, there is the case when the Tathagata appears in the world worthy and rightly self-awakened. He teaches the Dhamma, good in the beginning, good in the middle, good in the end. He proclaims the holy life, both in its particulars and its essence, entirely perfect and surpassingly pure. A householder or a householder's son, hearing the Dhamma, gains conviction and reflects and goes forth and so on. So this goes on to then teach the gradual training, which of course is a very important teaching, but I won't go into that now, because it would take too long. And we reach the end of the gradual training. Then he realizes the ending of suffering for himself. Such is the teaching of the Tathagata, and then 10 legitimate deductions can be drawn that give grounds for praising him. If beings experience pleasure and pain based on what is done in the past, obviously the Tathagata has done good things in the past. That's why he now feels such pleasure free from defilement. If beings experience pleasure and pain based on the creation of God, then Tathagata has been created by an excellent God. That's why he experiences such pleasure and pain. If it's just luck, obviously the Tathagata has got good luck, right? And so on and so forth. So this is the end of the sutta, and the monks were pleased and delighted in the Buddha's words. So this is the Devadaha Sutta, with the analysis of karma and asceticism, and comparing the Buddhist way of practice with the way of the Jains. I've been talking for a long time. We should have a bit of a short meditation, but does anyone have any questions on that sutta before we... Yeah?
Well, in general, what we've talked about so far, when you've talked of karma and rebirth, they come into existence seemingly at the same point in time, the notions.
Yes.
I wonder whether historically the notion of rebirth, to your knowledge, is out there in other countries and other places, so it's not necessarily connected to karma. So I know here with the indigenous people, 50,000 years of history, certainly there's signs that there was belief in rebirth there, which seems to be connected to karma in any way.
Right.
So is it in fact the case that the notion of rebirth and karma came together, or did karma come later?
Karma, certainly in the ethical sense of karma, came later, And what you say is quite true. The notion of rebirth is very, very common and is found in societies all around the world in lots of different ways, right? So it's conceived in all kinds of different forms. And this is something which is pointed out by Thomas McEvilley, who wrote this excellent book, The Shape of Ancient Thought. And one of the things he pointed out is that even though you can see his teaching on rebirth found in many different countries, there is a particular thing which he called the reincarnation complex or something like that. It's a set of ideas, and that set of ideas is firstly that karma, that we perform karma in an ethical sense, good and bad acts reaping good and bad results. That results in an endless series of rebirths through multiple different kinds of worlds, and that thirdly that the purpose of spiritual practice is freedom from that process, right? So those three essential ideas. Now those three essential ideas are shared in common by Buddhism, Jainism, and Hinduism, later Hinduism. We saw the seeds of that ideas within the Upanishads as well, right? But those ideas are also found in several of the major Greek philosophers, right? And so that reincarnation complex, he said, is only found in ancient Greece and ancient India. Yeah. And he argues because of a historical connection between them. Yeah. So that's the Shape of Ancient Thought by Thomas McEvilley. Yeah. So that reincarnation complex is shared between Buddhism, Jainism, and Hinduism, but of course it's conceived in slightly different ways in each one, but those basic ideas are still very similar. Okay, yeah.
But any such accounts
in the suttas? Very, very rarely. Yeah, there might be a few things, but no, you don't find it very commonly. Yeah. I'm not sure. I mean, the Buddha talked about, and when the Buddha talked about his own recollection of past lives, he tended to do it in a much more impersonal way. So he just I recollected this many past lives and so on, rather than actually telling stories about them. There's a few places where he did, but yeah, not many.
So the Jataka, is that all mythologically based in literature?
That's right, yeah. The Jatakas are a later strata of literature. So you do find a few Jataka stories in the four Nikayas. Okay, so a few places where the Buddha would tell a story, and then he would say, in that past life I was that king or that sage or something like that. There's about half a dozen or so out of all of the four Nikayas. Even there, most of them actually have the signs of being later. Okay, there may be one or two that seem the most authentic of all of the Jataka stories is the story of the chariot maker, which you find in the Anguttara Nikaya. I talked about this in the early Buddhism course. And one of the reasons for that being authentic was because the Buddha identified himself with a chariot maker, which was considered to be quite a low form of livelihood, right? He wasn't like, I was this great king or something like that, but he was a very ordinary craftsman in the past. So And it's also a very simple and straightforward text. But anyway, generally speaking, yes, the Jatakas are a later form of literature, and for the most part, the Jatakas are a collection of folk tales. Right? So, because there's so many hundreds of Jatakas, there's all kinds of different things in them, right? Some of them are, a lot of them are straightforward folk tales, some of them shared in common with like Aesop's fables and so on. Other ones are more more sophisticated mythology, like you find versions of stories from the Ramayana and the Mahabharata and things like that, told in the Jatakas. In some cases, actually, so something like the Ramayana, right? Little known fact is the earliest form of that story is actually in the Jatakas. Okay, so the story found in the Jatakas is a couple of hundred years or more earlier than any attested form in the Sanskrit literature. So these, for the most part, these were part of a floating mass of stories which were sort of part of the oral tradition at the time of the Buddha, most of which don't really have all that much to do with Buddhism, right? If you look at the substance of most of the Jataka stories, they tell a sort of, fairly straightforward ethical parable or something like that, and it's actually really nothing to do with Buddhism at all. It could be any religion might tell the same story. Some of them are more specifically Buddhist, but most of them aren't. So they're just stories which are around and which got told within a Buddhist sphere, and then eventually they kind of get adopted. It's like a literary conceit that you can have a way of, you can adopt them all and then make them all part of the Buddhist story. Yeah. So.
Also the other reading against this week, the Buddha is presented as a masterful orator, completely demolishes the opposition, and presents a perfectly reasonable account of his own.
Yeah.
To what extent can we accept this is a recording of a real conversation? Is it Buddhist propaganda? Was there ever any right reply for Jains, who are often very, very silent and don't even respond very thoroughly to the Buddha's words?
Sure, it would be nice to have more, but I don't know if they're particularly silent. There's plenty of suttas where the Jains and others were responding.
Like yes, no.
No. Yes, here it was, but in a lot of other places it's not. There's more extensive dialogue. Like I said, the kind of the interfaith suttas. If you look at them, there's a lot of different kinds of things there. You can't really characterize it one way or another. But look, for sure, obviously there's a tendency within the Buddhist text to have the Buddhists win, right? That's how it is. Within the Jaina text, there's one or two places where they have discussions of Buddhism, and the teachings they ascribe to Buddhism are not teachings which most Buddhists would enthusiastically adopt. Okay, so for example, they talk on this notion of karma, the very same thing. Okay, and this issue of whether karma is intentional or unintentional. So for the Jains, because karma is not related to intention, so if I'm walking along the path and I step on an ant, then I'm making bad karma. From a Buddhist point of view, it's only bad karma if you're doing it intentionally. Right? So the Jains then take that to the reductio ad absurdum and say that if a person is, I'm just trying to think of the exact how they actually get this thing, but if you leave a newborn baby in a stack of hay or something, if you put a baby to sleep in some straw, okay, and if somebody doesn't know that baby's there and they stick a sword through the straw and they kill the baby, okay, then not only do they not make bad karma, but if that baby were to be roasted and eaten, it would make a meal fit for a Buddha. Okay? So that's, I don't know, you're all Buddhists here. What do you think? Would you think that's a meal? I don't think that would be a meal fit for a Buddha. But anyway, so you can see that in a sense they have a point, right? That if a baby does die by accident, we don't necessarily think of that bad karma, except maybe being careless or something like that, right? So it's not a complete misrepresentation of Buddhist point of views, but certainly quite extreme. So, yeah, I mean, insofar as we can compare how the Jain views are depicted in the Buddhist texts with what we find in the Jaina texts, right? Usually they're pretty similar. Okay, so here's one of the Buddha's teachings on karma, and so here's a much more kind of straightforward teaching. Because I will teach you new and old karma, the cessation of karma and the way leading to the cessation of karma. Listen to that and attend closely. So here the Buddha is bringing the teaching of karma within the framework of the Four Noble Truths. And that becomes a bit more explicit when we look at the more detailed explanation. What bhikkhus is old karma? The eye is old karma, something to be seen as generated and fashioned by volition, as something to be felt. The ear is old karma, the mind, the ear, the nose, tongue, the body, and the mind is old karma, to be seen as generated and fashioned by volition, as something to be felt. This is called old karma. Right? So this is the idea that the body and all of the things we experience through the body has been created by karma in the past. Okay? So notice that this is different from the Jaina teaching, which is that everything that you experience has been created by past karma, right? So the Buddha is saying that your body and your capacity to experience, right, is created by past karma. The reason why we get reborn in this world is because of the acts we've done in the past, okay? But once we're here, of course, we experience many different kinds of things, many of which are just caused by what happens here and now. Some of which might be caused by past karma, but the main thing that's caused by the past karma is the actual existence of our body with its senses, which gives us the potential for experiencing these things. So is that distinction clear? Yeah?
I understand your distinction, but I don't see how that's in the text. I don't see how that's specific in what the Buddha is saying. That he's made this distinction with newcomer.
Right, yeah. Newcomer is what you're doing now. What don't you see there in the text?
Well, you're saying the old karma of the body existing is different to what the Dhammanet is saying. Is that
Right, yeah.
I don't see that that's written there in the text.
No. Is that a problem?
No, it's not a problem, but I just don't see it sometimes.
It's an explanation. Yeah. Most welcome to have a different explanation if you'd like.
I don't have one, but I think that, the distinction with the newcomer is that sort of
Yeah. I mean, I think it's implied. I think there are probably other places that talk about similar distinctions as well. But yeah, the basic idea is that the body is produced by karma. Sorry, did we have someone else? No? No. Yes?
With the Jains beliefs, so they were kind of punishing their bodies not because they actually saw direct, like something into the past lives.
Right.
But it's just a general belief, just having the body is going to cause suffering, therefore we should punish.
Right, they just had that faith in that idea, yeah.
So not because they actually saw they've done something wrong in their past life.
Right. Yeah. Okay, so what is new karma? Whatever action you do now by body, speech and mind is called new karma. So notice here that new karma is, it sounds like newcomer, doesn't it? New action, new deeds is in the place of the second noble truth here, right? So the old karma is in the place of the first noble truth, it's called suffering, and this is now in the second noble truth, is the origin of suffering, okay? And the next one is the cessation of karma when you reach liberation through the cessation of bodily, verbal and mental karma. This is called the cessation of karma, and what, of course, the third noble truth, and then what bhikkhus is the way leading to the cessation of karma. It is a noble eightfold path: right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right samadhi. Thus, bhikkhus, I've taught old karma, I've taught new karma, I've taught the cessation of karma, I've taught the way leading to the cessation of karma. Whatever should be done, bhikkhus, by a compassionate teacher, out of compassion for his disciples, desiring their welfare, that I have done for you. These are the feet of trees, bhikkhus, these are empty huts. Meditate, bhikkhus, do not be negligent, lest you regret it later. This is our instruction to you. Meditate, of course, being jhayata. Do jhanas, monks. Sorry, yes.
So if we go back and look at the Jain Sutra and that first we looked at the concept of faith, and that the Jains had this faith in what was said about Karma.
Right.
Isn't there a level of faith that you have to have as a Buddhist to believe in Karma and reincarnation as well, based on the word of the Lord? Because not many of us would have the foresight to see biggest birds and the rest. So yes, we can meditate, but many of us might reach that stage of knowing that yes, there's a concept of Karma, yes, there is a concept of rebirth.
Right.
Is there a faith element that?
Sure. But the difference is that the faith in Buddhism is contingent, it's not absolute. Yeah? So the faith is, it's not like we can never know and there's nothing that we can do to know and we only will ever rely on faith, right? It's that we have that faith which is based on reason, and there is a path by which we can realise those things. Yeah? And you maybe you haven't realised it yet, but sometimes these things take time, so you can't be unreasonable about it. Same thing in science, right? People can propose hypotheses, and sometimes it takes years before it's tested, right? And the classic example is the atomic theory, right? First proposed by Democritus in ancient Greece, was it 200 or 300 BC, and they couldn't be tested until the 19th century, right? It's more than 2,000 years, right? But it's still a perfectly valid scientific hypothesis. It just takes time sometimes. But in terms of testing it, then there, of course, are ways of testing it. We'll look at that. We'll look at some of those in some of the later workshops. But one of the most obvious ways is which most people experience in meditation, is you experience that the power of memory grows stronger. Right? This is one of the things that the Buddha said is the ability to recollect past lives comes from a deep experience of meditation. Right? So you have deep meditation, then you can recollect your past lives. Now, even if we haven't reached that level of depth of meditation, most people will know that your memory gets better when you meditate. I mean, this happens, you just sit there for 5 minutes and then you remember, oh, hang on, there was that appointment I was supposed to be at instead of meditating, right? Or if you go on retreat, it goes even further. Once your mind's settled down for 3 or 4 days, you'll start remembering things from your childhood, right? So even though you haven't recollected it yet, but there's still a reason to think, oh, if my meditation was more clear, perhaps I might be able to recollect even further. Yeah? So you can see that difference between the Buddha called reasoned faith, akaravati saddha, as opposed to blind faith, which is that not only do we not know, but we can never know. Yeah? So it's not that knowing is necessarily easy. Again, the same in science, right? I mean, we say science is verifiable, right? Anyone can do the experiment. Sure, anyone can do it. Just go to university for 10 years and get your PhD if you're intelligent enough to actually pass, and then find a laboratory with millions of dollars of equipment and the time to use it and so on and so forth, and then you can test it, right? It doesn't mean that just anybody should be able to test it all the time. These are subtle truths, and to test them takes subtle means. Yeah.
Okay, can I ask a question?
Yes. Yes, of course.
Am I right in thinking that volition arises as an intrinsic property of every experience?
Maybe.
So it arises as one of those 5 properties, otherwise known as the khandhas.
Uh-huh.
So when the Buddha talks about the 5 attributes of clinging,
Right.
suffering, volition arises as one of those.
Yes. Yeah.
So I don't know where I'm going with this yet, but maybe I'm trying to understand. If volition is also that kind of push into the next moment. Is everything else,
Right.
all the other 4, you would say, oh yeah, they're there. Don't worry about it.
Uh-huh.
But volition is the one thing that kind of tips you into the next moment.
Right.
Is that right?
Yes. Volition is the driver towards the future. Yeah. So just in the five khandhas, you can think of the five khandhas like sanya, perception, is tends to be orientated towards the past. Right? It's about recognition, patterns. What have you experienced before? How do you interpret and understand what's happening now? Whereas sankhara, it's the fourth khandha, tends to be orientated towards the future. Not always, but tends to be plan making, intention making, volition. Yeah.
So, if that volition arises as an intrinsic property of the experience that we're trying to know and make conscious, how do we determine in that moment which direction we go? Is that just something that over time becomes a behaviour that we force ourselves, we use our willpower or our free will for such a thing? Because you see, I don't free. It kind of says that there's no such thing as free will.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm struggling with how all these bits of the jigsaw fit together. I mean, I know what volition on a macro level looks like,
Right.
because I use it every day.
Right.
And I can say, right, in this moment, what is going to be
Sure.
activated? But on the micro level, on that nano level, I don't get the ideas. Or another question, does it link in
Because that one, there wasn't enough in that one.
I'm thinking volition, and so I'm missing that sankhara.
Okay.
Starting where the definition of sati is remembering what we're supposed to be doing in the moment. And is that the root?
I'm thinking that if I was to answer that question, I would either give a very general answer which would be long and complicated and which may well not address the specific concern which you're getting towards, which I'm not entirely sure that I understand. So can we maybe just leave that for now? And maybe look at that sometime later, because I'm conscious also we're kind of running out of time. So I don't know if I can really address that adequately, or I don't know if I can address it at all. But even if I was to try to, I don't even know if it would be adequate. Is that okay? This is going to torment you, isn't it? You're sitting there being tormented at me.
I'm not being tormented at you. I'm making a volition. I'm using that term kind. Peaceful and let go, so just let go.
Okay, okay, very good. Alrighty, so we are running a bit short of time, so we won't look at too many of these other texts that we have here, but I'll just look at this one sutta, which is quite an interesting little one. Another short sutta, this one from the Anguttara Nikaya, and this is the one which was identified by a number of scholars as having possibly, certainly being somewhat difficult to reconcile with the rest of the Buddha's teachings, and being possibly a sign of an influence of Jaina ideas in the early Buddhist texts. So this is kind of a curious little thing. So just to remember that when we talk about the suttas, we talk about what the Buddha was teaching, on the whole, there's a very strong consistency and uniformity to what the Buddha was teaching. But there are always a few bits and pieces which you look at and you say, hey, I'm not quite sure where that's coming from. And so this is one of those ones which is maybe just towards a slight bit to an edge where it maybe have a bit of a Jaina influence there. And that was argued by Venerable Analayo in his comparative study of this sutta. Anyway, let's have a look at it. Because I do not say that there is the ending of volitional karma that has been done and accumulated so long as one has not experienced its results. And that may be in this very life or in the next rebirth or on some subsequent occasion. But I do not say that there is a making of an ending of suffering so long as one has not experienced the results of volitional karma that has been done and accumulated. This noble disciple bhikkhus, who is thus devoid of longing, devoid of ill will, unconfused, clearly comprehending, ever mindful, dwells pervading one quarter. with a mind imbued with loving kindness, likewise the second, the third, and the fourth. Thus above, below, across, and everywhere, and to all as to himself. He dwells pervading the entire world with a mind imbued with loving kindness, vast, exalted, measureless, without enmity, without ill will. He understands thus, previously my mind was limited and undeveloped, but now it is measureless and well developed. No measurable karma remains or persists there. What do you think? Because if a youth were to develop the liberation of mind by loving kindness from his childhood on, would he do a bad deed? No, Bhante. Could suffering affect him if he does no bad deed? No, Bhante. For on what account would suffering affect one who does no bad deed? A woman or man should develop this liberation of mind by loving kindness. A woman or man cannot take this body with them when they go. Mortals have mind as their core. Not sure what word we're using for core there. So here's a number of interesting points on karma here. First of all, a point on that limited or limitless karma. And this is something which Richard Gombrich talks about in his interview, that the effects of karma, right from the earliest time in the Vedic literature, is always felt to be limited. Okay? And this way also is quite distinct from ritual as done, say, in the monotheistic religions. Okay? And if you're in the Catholic religion, for example, you do the ritual of communion, right? And through the ritual of communion and so on and so forth, then you go to heaven, right? And you go to heaven forever. Yeah? You have infinite bliss and happiness with your God forever. So you do a limited ritual, yeah? Not just going to heaven, right? I mean, there's other things to it, right? Apart from doing the ritual, but this is an important part of it. By doing the ritual, then you create, in a sense, a karma. Obviously, they don't talk in terms of karma, but that's what you're doing, which is a finite karma with an infinite result. Okay? And this is what we find in the monotheistic religions. Whereas in the Indian religions, in the Brahmanical religion, this was never the idea. Right? Heaven was always felt to be limited. And we saw that in those Upanishadic texts. You go for a period of time to live on the moon, you're wandering around the moon, how are you going, guys? Playing golf or waving at the American astronauts or whatever you're doing there. Or you go to the sun and for a while, and then you come back here. So it's a limited cause with a limited result. Okay? And so here, the Buddha's saying that if you have this very powerful, limitless state of mind, right? Through meditation, you develop loving kindness, right? Brahma Viharas. Brahma Viharas, incidentally, which are found in Buddhism, Jainism, and Hinduism. But these, in that state of mind, your mind is limitless, it's measureless, it's so powerful and expansive that any limited karma can't have any effect there. So it means that if you've done a bad deed or something like that, it's just going to be so overwhelmed by the power, the magnificence of this karma. So, and somebody who had that strength in their mind from that, then they wouldn't do anything bad. You know, if your mind, imagine, was filled with loving kindness, then of course you wouldn't do any bad deeds. Okay, so the noble disciple understands, whatever bad deed I did here in the past with this deed-born body is all to be experienced here. Okay? It will not follow along. When the liberation, so in other words, the noble disciple, meaning someone who's enlightened, he's saying here that any bad karma I've made in the past, I'm going to experience in this very life, right? I'm not going to experience in any future life. And this is this is what I was saying before, this is a somewhat unusual and somewhat controversial statement. It's not entirely clear what it means. Normally, a noble disciple, for example, would include a stream enterer who might have up to 7 future lives, okay? And it seems to imply that the stream enterer can't experience any results of bad karma in any of those future 7 lives. Maybe it's the case. And perhaps it's also implying that for an arahant, someone who's enlightened in this very life, fully enlightened, that they will experience all of their bad karma before the end of this life. We'll go on, read a little bit further. So this is this is the reflection that the noble disciple understands. When the liberation of mind by loving kindness has been developed in this way, it leads to non-returning for a wise bhikkhu here who does not penetrate to a further liberation. So it means at least you get non-returning. This noble disciple bhikkhu who is thus devoid of longing, devoid of ill will, unconfused, clearly comprehending, ever mindful, dwells pervading one direction with a mind imbued with compassion, mudita and equanimity, and the same reflections apply. And then the same ending, a woman or man should develop this liberation of mind by equanimity. A woman or a man cannot take this body with them when they go. Mortals have mind as their core. The noble disciple understands whatever bad deed I did here in the past with this deed-born body is all to be experienced here. It will not follow along. When the liberation of mind by equanimity has been developed in this way, it leads to non-returning for a wise bhikkhu here who does not penetrate to a further liberation. So again, this is, I think, a bit of a slightly controversial sutta. I don't want to necessarily go into it too much, but I think you can see that it seems to have that kind of slight flavour of that idea that we somehow have to experience all of the results of our bad karma. Normally, of course, in Buddhism, the idea is not that you don't get enlightened by experiencing the results of your bad karma, but by understanding what the nature of karma is. Okay, that's the Four Noble Truths. Four Noble Truths don't say anything about you have to experience all the results of your bad karma. What the Four Noble Truths say is that you understand what is the cause of suffering. Okay, if you act out of greed, hatred, and delusion, you do things and you make karma which create suffering. You understand that. And that's what liberation consists of. So this is a bit, so the text is a bit unclear, perhaps a bit corrupt, and as it has been suggested, perhaps influenced by Jainism. Any thoughts on that?
Is it also Jainist in the sense that you said that they seek an ideal of purity? So that kindness is a way to get purity?
Well, love and kindness is very commonly taught in the Buddhist text.
So in Jainism?
And Jainism and Brahmanism, yeah.
Does it give you the purity and innocence that you mentioned that Jainists seek?
I'm not sure exactly what the function of the Brahma Viharas are within Jainism, what they actually teach, I'm not sure how they teach them. I just know when I was at the World Parliament in Melbourne, and I talked a bit about the four Brahma Viharas, and there was a Jain fellow in the audience, and he came up and we spoke about it afterwards. He said, yeah, we have the same thing in Jainism. So I'm not sure what historical period it belongs to or how exactly it fits into the philosophy. Yeah.
But the one that's suffering effects, so it doesn't, its suffering will come. Always suffering, everybody has bodily suffering, but it doesn't affect this mind. As long as, you have equanimity and your mind is suffering. Yeah, that's what it means. What's the effect?
Well, sure. Normally we would understand that if somebody's enlightened, that they certainly can experience the results of bad karma. And if they do so, then they would have equanimity towards that and let go of it and not react to it. Yeah? But the implication here seems to be that you have to experience all the results of your bad karma, which is a slightly different kind of idea. Yeah.
Is this in Agamas?
Yeah, this is part of Analayo's discussion. You can have a look at it for the details, but there's some interesting differences between the Pali and the Agama versions, which is one of the reasons why it's thought that it may be a later development. Let's just see if I've got that handy. Not sure.
Does the Pali actually say man or woman? Or is that
Probably, yeah.
politically correct interpretation? Women aren't mentioned very much.
Yeah, it's a slightly unusual idiom, which might also be a sign of a textual kind of issue. What does it say? Oh yeah. Yes, it says Itiya wa bhikkhave purisassa wa nayan kama wadaya gamaniyo. By a woman or by a man, this body is not taken and gone on with. Yeah, so it does say by a woman or by a man. It's actually the normal idiom, or very common idiom in Pali, that the female is mentioned first. So if you talk about parents, you always talk about mata pitu, mother and father, rather than father and mother. Yeah. Where are we now? Okay, yeah, so here, this is another study on that. So just very briefly, Analayo's study on the comparative study of this particular sutta, or actually not exactly this sutta, but a related sutta. Yeah, that the results of karma have to be inevitably experienced. Right, so then he mentions that the Karajakaya Sutta, which is not the same one we looked at, but it's similar, has two parallels in Chinese. One parallel in Chinese, another parallel in Tibetan. Both of these parallel versions begin their exposition by affirming the inevitability of karmic retribution, but differ from the Karajakaya Sutta in that they do not make a statement about the need of experiencing karmic retribution in order to be able to make an end of dukkha. So that specific thing that says you have to experience all of this karma in order to make an end of suffering is absent from both of the parallel versions. So again, this is sort of seeming to reinforce the idea that it may be an interpolation, or maybe not part of the original text.
Bhante, actually, look at the extreme case of Agurimala. The amount of the consequences of the bad karma experience only dependent on others around us. Mm-hmm. You know, thanks to the Buddha, the Agurimala did not experience the full extent of his bad karma. We experience if there was different situation,
right.
You know, being caught and put in the prison.
Right.
So
yeah.
sometimes there are beings around him, around oneself, that actually pull one out.
Sure. Yeah.
Out of the dangers that one is heading towards.
Yeah, and of course this is one of the teachings which will be part of the future workshops. Is the way that you experience karma is contextual. Again, this idea of a seed, right? You plant a mango seed. From a mango seed, you're not going to get apples, right? Unless you're Monsanto, okay? But typically you get mangoes. But do you get many or few? Are they fruiting this year or next year? Are they sweet or sour? Well, that depends on all the other conditions around it. Yeah, so the manner in which karma fruits is not deterministic. Yeah, the karma affects the quality of the fruit, but it doesn't determine exactly all the details of it. Yeah. Okay, one more question.
Yeah. This days, like, talk about the Buddhist chief disciples,
Uh-huh.
and what happened in the past life.
You should have been, were you here in the first workshop?
Yeah.
Ah, you see, this is your problem. You should have been here for the first workshop. This was one of the myths which was busted in the myth-busting workshop last month. Have a look at it online. Okay? Myths busted. All the stories about Mahamoggallana and so on, these are from the commentaries. Yeah. So have a look at that in the next one. Okay, so to just recap what we've looked at today, and we've tried to put the teaching of karma in a context, because things derive meaning from context. We have our own context right? We are sitting here in the Buddhist library. The Buddhist library is sitting here in Sydney. Sydney sits here in Australia. Australia is in the world. This earth is flying through space, whirling around the sun. A fairly insignificant sun in an obscure region of one galaxy among billions. And here we are, sitting here thinking that we're important and the things that we talk about have some significance. However, we haven't yet even begun to talk about the really important questions on karma. One of the most important questions of karma, of course, is the question if you can be born in different places as a result of your karma. Is this a way that we could learn to travel through space? Right? This is the most important question, right? Can we in fact learn to travel to other space systems and find out about other kinds of intelligent life by dying and getting reborn there as a karmic messenger?
We have to learn fast.
And then we have to come back again. Yeah? This is the most important question. Okay, it's not perhaps not the most important question.
Bhante, I've got a question
Go on.
which we couldn't really resolve, which is how do you know what is karma and what is not? Like the results.
Go on. Oh, so if something happens to you,
Yeah.
how do you know whether this happens to you as a result of karma, which has? I don't think you can. Yeah. I mean, the Buddha, one of the famous statements, the Buddha said, karma visaya is achinteya, so the realm of karma is unthinkable. And if you think about it, you go mad. So yeah, things can happen to you, but they happen from all kinds of causes, and it's cause and effect is very, very difficult, right? I mean, just think of, important example in our society is like tobacco and cancer, right? I mean, we've known for decades that smoking causes cancer, but to actually prove it, right? It took so many, it's not as if you have a small sample size, right? I mean, you've got millions and millions and millions of people smoking cigarettes every day all over the world, right? And it's still incredibly hard to prove a direct causal link between cancer and tobacco, yeah? So, yeah, causality is not easy to work out, so practically speaking, I don't think we can. Go on.
Is karma ever separate from an act, like 100% separate?
So, can you
Well, I mean,
know?
there's 10,000 reasons that something happens.
Yeah.
You could say karma is one of those.
Karma is that's right. I mean, karma is part of it. I mean, karma is always there in the sense of creating the capacity to experience all those things, right? So it's a necessary condition. Yeah.
Just your existence is the one cause that you will experience maybe.
Yeah.
Well, karma can be separate to an act. It's a future karma and there's no intention.
If there's a future karma and there's no intention.
The good, what is it called? The forward-looking karma, where it's active doing.
Right.
So karma can be separate to an act where there's no intention. So you step on an ant, but you don't have an intention. So you
Okay.
a separate act to karma, and you're not.
Oh, okay. Sure. Yeah. Not everything we do is karmically significant. Yeah.
So it doesn't resonate in a different way?
What doesn't resonate in a different way?
She's asking, can you tell the difference between karmic things and non-karmic?
Okay, so can we tell the difference between karmic thing and non-karmic things?
Can
We-
we decipher the difference? I was just wondering, does it resonate in a different way?
Yeah. So is there like a different feeling to it or a different tone? Can you sense that? Maybe if you're very sensitive. Yeah. I'm not sure how you'd be able to test it really reliably. I mean, there's some cases where you can kind of eliminate cause after cause after cause, and you think, come on, right? But yeah, it's still just really hard to know. It's just an inference. Yeah.
Sorry, my question was, how can we be satisfied with this explanation of karma?
Mm.
It is unknowable and it will send us mad. why isn't such a fundamental aspect of Buddha's teachings easily apprehensible?
Well, the principle is easily apprehensible, but the details aren't.
There's a saying in my tradition, we say, if you want to know your past karma, look at your present situation. And if you want to know your future destination, look at your present actions.
Yeah. 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 Seems to be messy. You want everything to...
Can you like
The world is...
rebalance karma? Like if you tend to be achieved by getting, I don't know, if you went bald at an early age, I'm trying to think of a good example.
Okay.
But can you donate to, I don't know, this is a stupid example.
So you go bald at an early age, you donate to a wig-making charity,
Exactly.
and miraculously, boom, your hair sprouts again.
Or you're kind of balancing off the karma that you keep experiencing. Is that like
Pay you off. I think, but a lot of people try to do that. At least in our tradition, clean water, and then your relatives have water in the heavens, or
Right, yeah.
give money to a monastery and you'll be rich.
Or hammers.
Hammers is good.
We've had an epidemic of Venerable Mudito is one of the monks who does the building at Bodhinyana Monastery, and he's well aware of the difficulty that we have now in storing all of the hammers up in the shed, because there's what they call him Taya Mordu, is a seer. He's like a
Fortune teller.
it's like a fortune teller kind of thing, yeah. He came, visited Perth, and he told the Thai people that they had to offer hammers to the monastery, right? And it's like, he's kind of sitting there, and they, people come every day, and they're very kind, and they offer some food, and usually people might offer some water, or maybe some robes, some simple things like toothpaste and soap and this kind of thing, and then somebody offered some hammers, right? And you're thinking, that's kind of unusual, right? But that's, half a dozen hammers, that's kind of nice. And then the next day somebody else comes and there's another box full of hammers and scissors, right? And then the next day it's more, we're starting to think, what's going on here, right? Can you remember the reason? Did they give a reason why they had to offer hammers?
No, no, I can't remember, but the fortune teller just said, who offers the most hammers and get the reward or something. So
There's maybe like your relatives needed a place to live in the afterlife, so they didn't have any hammers for building their buildings or something. I don't know why, we don't know why. Anyway, there's all these hammers. Eventually Ajahn Brahm had to sort of say, enough. He said if you want to know about offering dana, you come to the monks, we're the experts, okay? No more hammers. Sorry?
No, he said that the answer is like, give us a Bunnings card so we buy our own hammers. You don't have to get us the hammers, we can buy our own hammers. So it's, gift cards.
But we won't be having a hammer shortage anytime soon.
I'm sure you don't think this is a silly question. There's a lot of news, like in the modern days, like for example, people will say, say something keeps happening, or whatever they'll say, the universe is telling you to do this.
Okay, yep.
What do you think about that? How is karma related to that? I can't see the connection.
Yeah, well, to me this makes sense in terms of, I like the Jungian idea of synchronicity, which is usually completely misinterpreted by people, and people think that synchronicity means that the universe is telling you something, but it's got nothing to do with that actually. There's a lovely story about synchronicity, comes from one of Jung's books. He was listening to a lady, he was counselling a lady, and she'd been coming to see him for a long time, and they never got anywhere. Like everything, it was really stuck. He didn't know what to do. There was no progress and so on. And she was sitting there, and she had her back to him, and she was telling the story about a dream she'd had. And in her dream, she'd seen an Egyptian scarab beetle, and she was telling the dream about this scarab beetle and what was happening. And Jung was sitting there and feeling kind of bored and like, this is going nowhere, and I don't know what this dream is all about, and what am I doing here, and so on. And he heard this scratching behind him, and he turned around, and on the window pane was a scarab beetle scratching on the outside of the window. And while she was talking, he sort of just very quietly opened the window up and took the beetle in his hands. And he waited till she finished talking, and then he just said to her, "Here's your beetle." And then after that, he said, therapy proceeded well and she got better. Okay. So this is the idea of synchronicity. It's not that her dream made the scarab beetle appear, right? But that the appearance of it was something in which we can find meaning. Yeah? Because the human mind is a meaning-seeking machine. Right? We want to find meaning. We look at the clouds and we find meaning in all the pictures in the clouds, or look at the stars and we find meaning there. We're looking to find that meaning. And so these things happen, and if we choose to, we can find the meaning in those things. Right? So, this is what synchronicity means. It doesn't mean that the kind of the world is happening, the universe is giving you a message, but it means that we can find messages in what the universe is presenting us.
If she's allowed to ask a silly question. So that thing I was saying about balancing repetitive karma, you think there's nothing to it?
No, it's not about balancing it out, but the simile, it was in one of the later readings, but the simile the Buddha gave was the simile of the teaspoon of salt. Huh? So you have a spoon of salt, you put a spoon of salt in a glass of water, and the water's very salty. You put the spoon of salt in a lake of water, and you can't even taste it. And so it's not that it's been balanced out in a sense, but it's just like overwhelmed. If you do lots of good karma, it's still there, right? The salt is still there, but it doesn't really matter. It's 5 o'clock now. We should probably wrap up. And thanks everybody for your attendance and attention once more this week.